Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to hang with us while we had a few little internet issues because that's what you have when you go live online. There's nothing like a live event where you go ahead and you have lovely internet issues. But thank you, Kit, so much for overcoming and making it today. You guys, it is Healthy Soils Week. I'm so happy to have everyone here. It is really exciting. We've already had one speaker with the UC Master Gardener program. And we're having another speaker today who's also a UC Master Gardener volunteer, Kit Veerkamp. We're so excited that this week is off to such a great start. We've got blogs, we've got lives, we've got soil testing and other activities going online. We've partnered with CDFA, USDA. There's so much going on. We're just really excited to have everyone here who wants to learn about healthy soil. And this is a great segue into something called the soil food web. And Kit is here today to explain it to us. And although it is only a half hour, Kit is going to try and jam some great information in here, guys, because I'm sure she could talk about it for 4 because soil is so important. Kit, take it away.
Okay, great. Thank you, Lauren. And welcome, everybody. This is going to be fast and furious because there's just so much information. Everything we know about soils, it's all new in this last 10, 15 years, and just we keep learning more. So here we go. This is to help you understand more. We're going to be talking, I'm going to share some resources with you right up front, talk about the mechanical aspects of soil, jump into what the soil food web is, and how you can make that work for you to improve your soil. And of course, we'll answer questions along the way. So these are some references in terms of books that are great for the layperson and serious gardener, along with the USDA has a wonderful website. Just Google USDA Soil Food Web, and you'll come up with their pages. They're very advanced in their resources. So everything we know as master gardeners is our soil is so important to the success of whether we're gardening with traditional landscaping, native landscaping, or trying to grow our own food. Topsoil formation occurs because of the whole cycle of moving the waste material in terms of droppings, the leaves, stems, etc., and that gets moved back into the soil and enriching the mineral aspect of, that we would call dirt. And the functions of the soil are really vast. And what we know now, I mean, all life depends on the soil, even more so because we all depend on plants and those depend on the soil. So traditionally, we think of soil and soil profiles, and we're really concerned as gardeners with that O level and the A level, particularly, and of course, the trees and shrubs and all that, and many organisms get down somewhat into the subsoil. But this is the tradition. So our soil is really composed of 3 major elements: the weathered rock and minerals that come from below in your place. And then 50% of good soil is composed of water and air, and then another, if we're really lucky, 5% organic matter. Most of the soils here in California, or especially where I live in the foothills, are much less than that. Naturally occurring tend to be more like 2%. So they're low, and that's what our native plants are adapted to. So the air and water component of soils is exceptionally important because it's how the soils, both organisms live in this space, but the water needs to move in and out and replenish, and the air needs to be there also for the soil, for plant roots to function and grow properly. And so as water and air move through, it pushes out old air, old water, brings in new, and keeps the system going. So typically we think of also soil in terms of its texture. We either know or are aware that soils can be made up of clay, silt, or sand. And this really shows you the relative particle sizes. Clays aren't even visible to the naked eye. They're only visible microscopically. And so they really tend to cling together more, compact more, but they're also a better soil texture for growing plants for many reasons. I'm not going to get into that. So our soil structure is also very important in terms of how it looks and how it operates, because it affects the drainage and that air circulation. The arrangement, again, so it affects the soil and how it works. So good soil structure is granular, it's crumbly, you can get your hands into it, you're not having to jackhammer it out, and it resists drying and holds on to nutrients better. Whereas poor soil structure, like I said, you could hardly get a shovel through it. There's little air for roots and organisms because it's so compacted, and therefore those nutrients aren't available to your plants. And many people deal with this by overwatering and fertilizing, which further negatively impacts soil structure. So knowing what your soils are is really important. I'm not going to talk about the mechanics or how to do the jar test. I want you to see what this is, write it down, Google it. There's all kinds of great stuff online on how to do this, but you can measure, you can get an idea of what your own soils are by doing this soils test, walking through the steps. Then you need to be able to do a little math to find out what the percentages that you're seeing in the jar are, and then you can come to the soil triangle and get a good idea about what type of soil you actually have. Many people in the area I live think they have clay, and they do not. My soil is tight and compacted when it's during the summer, but I have what is called a silty loam, which kind of looks and behaves somewhat like a clay. The easiest way to determine your soils is go to the NRCS Web Soil Survey. You can put in your address. This is my property. You can see I've got two major zones in there. This upper zone on the front of my property, but where my home is a different, where a garden back in here has got a totally different soil, but it tells me I have these silty loams. So this is a very helpful tool for you to determine what yours are. So a good healthy soil is also, we use the term as master gardeners, tilthy. It breaks up easy, it's rich, it's movable, and plants love it. It's good structure and texture. The texture really doesn't matter. You can still, what you can't modify is the texture of your soil. The percentages of silt, sand, and clay. You would have to literally replace your soil in order to change that. What you can change is your structure, how it works, and that happens with organic matter. We'll be talking more about that. And then, of course, the density or level of compaction, how it drains, and its water holding capacity. One of the things as a gardener, no matter what, is you really need to understand how well your soil drains, and you can easily test that yourselves by digging a hole, filling it with water, and then timing how long it takes to drain. If it takes longer than 8 hours, you've got some major issues, and it modifies. One of the reasons it's so important to understand this is because it really affects how you irrigate. So please do that if you suspect, especially if your plant leaves are turning yellow when they shouldn't be in midsummer. And if you're watering and you're getting this yellowing, chances are, rather than too dry, your soils may be too wet. Your soil color will tell you a lot about the health of your soils. Right here, this large arrow is pointing to the ultimate, what we want our soils to look like. Now, my soils naturally somewhere range in this color, a little bit of iron oxide in there, or this. And I have now added enough organic matter to most of my garden areas to make it this chocolate brown. That's the goal. the traditional soils tests for nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium really don't tell us a lot because we know that they're in the soils, but it does not mean that they are available to the plants. These agricultural tests are designed to tell you how much fertilizer you need to apply to your soils. But again, without the right chemistry and without your soils being in good condition, sometimes what it results in is you just keep adding more chemicals to the soil, and that's what we want to get away from. Also, understanding your soil pH is important because it affects the uptake of nutrients in the soil. There's this very happy range between 5.56 up to about 8, 7.5, where you want your soil pH to be. Most soils are in that range, and especially if you have vegetation naturally growing out on your properties, this will be because one of the things that's wonderful, and we'll talk about the soil food web, is plants and the organisms modify the soil pH to be something that they can survive in. But knowing this, if you're having uh, trouble with the uptake, you're having deficits show up in your plants, look at your soil pH. That could be a cause of the problem. So most of us have been around long enough to understand that the typical gardening approaches in the past have been to rototill, fertilize, water, 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 and raking away your leaves, very common, still trying to talk people out of doing that, spraying with herbicides and killing pests with insecticides. Hopefully, we're all moving away, way, way away from that. And as gardeners, it's really easy to rely on this blend of old wives' tales and anecdotal science, and particularly to go to nurseries and be sold things because that's what they do. That's what they do to stay in business. And it's that part is still not necessarily gone away. But as master gardeners, we have learned to rely on scientific information and evidence studies in terms of how we approach our gardening. And that's what we teach. So the old approach was to really rely in terms of soil science to look at physical structure and that whole nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium chemistry of the soil. Whereas the new approach, the new paradigm, is to understand what's going on in the soil, to manage the soil in an ecological way that is balanced and healthy, and let those organisms that are in the soil do the work for you. Everybody will be happier about this. So getting away from cultivating the soil, we need to be looking to the soil food web to connect us back to natural processes that they have been doing forever. You will reap the benefits in terms of less work and having to put a whole lot less effort, especially in terms of chemicals, into your yard, onto your garden. So most of us are familiar with the process of photosynthesis. Energy in the terms of sunlight hits the leaves, the chlorophyll and all of that energetically, chemically converts that into carbohydrates or sugars in the plants, and that's what the plant grows on, feeds on, and so does everything else. Almost everything else out there in nature benefits from this process of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is the mechanism for carbon sequestration. These sugars that the plants, carbohydrates that the plant manufacture are referred to as exudates. And these not only are taken up by the leaves and used by the plant itself, but they're secreted out through the roots into the rhizosphere, which is that area around the roots. And so healthy plants get relatively 80 to 90% of their nutrients through this carbon exchange that occurs through the process of photosynthesis. The soil food web are those microorganisms that are in the soil, in the water and air interface, working around and living in that soil. And it is a whole pyramid in itself in terms of how this works. There's levels that include the bacteria and or other really microscopic organisms that have a whole interaction and feed on each other. Then we have the mycorrhizal fungi, and then going up into what we call the macroorganisms, those that you can see. This is another good image in terms of what types, especially this is macroorganisms, which we can see and do see out in our gardens. And they're all a part of this system. So again, you can kind of see that back under the ground, there's just a whole nother world that we do not see in operation here. For every teaspoon of soil, there's an excess of so many organisms, more organisms than people who ever lived on the earth in the soil, working and in there to make healthy soils. Where plants exist, where you don't have plant materials, these numbers drop way down because it takes this interaction of these organisms relying on the sugars produced by plants to have this, and they have a symbiotic relationship. So having a healthy soil food web eliminates or greatly reduces the need for any kind of fertilizers, especially chemical fertilizers, pesticides because plants are healthy and not as prone to pests, herbicides, again, weeds come in because generally they're filling a spot that some healthy plant hasn't taken up. And then the need for fungicides, we'll talk about that. They increase and improve the water and air holding capacity of your soil. And just think about everything you've ever heard or been told about compost in your soil. It increases. It's because it's that organic matter feeding the soil organisms. And you will have healthier and more productive plants with a natural system in place. And you just think about it, you go out for a hike in the forest or the woodlands, nobody fertilizes those environments. Our leaves naturally fall, they decay, they get taken up and incorporated back into the soil by these soil organisms, keeping everything healthy. So the primary organisms at the very bottom of the food chain in the soil are the bacteria, fungi, protozoa, and nematodes, which are mostly microscopic in nature. Sometimes you can see nematodes, but most of them are so small you cannot.
Kit, I do have a question for you.
Uh-huh.
Seems like a really good time.
Okay.
How can you tell the difference between mold and fungus in soil?
You probably cannot. And a healthy soil, you don't need to worry about that. And some of the molds, and I will be talking about this, some of the
Perfect.
molds are perfectly fine and healthy, like some of the slime molds. I commonly see dog vomit slime molds on mulch piles. A lot of people do, and I've got pictures. So I will talk a little more about this and the balance that occurs when you have a healthy soil food web.
Great, thank you.
So, uh-huh. So these soil organisms start by plant material is decaying. You've got fungi and bacteria and other organisms actually start their process even before the leaves even drop off the trees. As they're starting to decay and they excise and they fall to the ground, they are immediately in decay mode. So there's already organisms involved in breaking those down. And then they get crunched and they start breaking down into smaller pieces. You've got organisms that chew them up and they start just getting incorporated into the soil. And those we'll talk about this process. So they end up sequestering the nitrogen and other nutrients that are coming as a result, that are being made available as a result of this decay and incorporation. They're fixing nitrogen from the atmosphere. They enhance the aggregation and porosity of the soil by their mere presence and their metabolic functions. They prey on pests and other more harmful forms of their own, all the species in terms of bacteria or fungi or the molds, etc. There's always the side where they aren't healthy for the soil, but it's having the healthy populations that keeps all of that in check. And they're food for each other. This is an amazing food cycle, food chain, a big loop. So the benefits of the soil food web are its ability to nurture healthy plants. And think of these microorganisms as nutrient facilitators, because that's what they're doing. They're constantly making the nutrients available from this decaying matter back to other organisms and the roots of plants. I love this book, Soul of the Soil is really a good one. It's through the activities of soil microbes that these basic raw materials needed by plants become available at the right time and in the right form and amount. We affectionately call it a poop loop for good reason, because these decomposers are, and the organisms that are feeding on each other then have to excrete the remains. And that's just, again, more nutrients being made available for something else that constantly stay in the cycle. So there's two forms of carbon cycling, and it's the organic carbon that is particularly important in this cycle, because it's what's being constantly cycled, whereas the inorganic carbon that's a part of the minerals is not quite as critical in that process, because it becomes available so slowly. But it still does eventually provide some forms of the nutrients. So a healthy food web really does help control disease. And again, as I mentioned, not all organisms are beneficial. We all are aware that there are soil diseases and types of nematodes, root nematodes, that are not beneficial. But when your soil community is diverse enough and healthy enough, they keep those competitions, they keep the pathogens in check and under control. The nitrogen cycling, there is generally enough nitrogen in your soil to keep most of your plants healthy. Now, if you're growing vegetables in that, what you need to pay attention to when you're growing food is that you're harvesting stuff that would normally go back into the soil if no one was there to harvest and collect it. So you do need to add organic matter back into the soil to make up for the fact that you are taking away part of that vegetation that isn't being returned to the soil. I'm going to just cover a few of the organisms that we see and know that these are healthy. There's nothing wrong with, I know normally we're thinking bacteria associated with colds and, well, that's those viruses, but anyway, there are non-beneficial bacteria. And excuse me, when Alexa decided she wanted to participate in this, so excuse me. So the bacteria are chemosynthesizers, and they're the very base level of the soil food web. They are the food for almost everything else and themselves. Anaerobic bacteria, when you have a lack of adequate oxygen, that's when things can get dicey. If your soils are too compacted or too wet, then you're not going to have the ability of the good types of bacteria to keep the pathogenic bacteria under control. So your soil conditions are very important in making sure that that does not happen. What's really interesting is that bacteria produce this biofilm in the soil that actually allows a lot of these organisms to survive and move through soils, especially when they're drier. Um, and they control the pH of your soil and provide a protective barrier in the areas where they live. Again, this anaerobic bacteria, we've got, E. coli and Clostridium are examples of that. And oftentimes, if you get really smelly soil, it's because of the presence of them. Fungi there's a number of different forms of fungi. And here's a list of those. Most of them, again, we see the positive aspects of those in our lives. They are the primary agent for starting the decay of organic matter, and especially the lignin and cellulose. They're the hard parts of the tree in terms of the chitin shells of insects and the bones of animals. That is not going to be broken down by bacteria. That's the role of fungi in your soil. So they really play a very important function. You can see here that they've got quite an important role in terms of having healthy soil. So what we see when we see mushrooms is those are the reproductive parts, the aspects, the reproductive bodies of fungi. But what you don't typically see is the underground portions, which we refer to as mycorrhizae. And anybody who's been gardening long enough knows that's a term we're seeing quite often. So they grow in association with the roots of plants. And there are many species. Almost every plant has some association with mycorrhizae in the soil that expands the reach of its root system, because you've got this whole another system of mycorrhizae that then is interlinked with the roots and help transport the nutrients and water and other materials to the plants, and they trade the sugars for nutrients and all the rest. They help aerate the soil and then way expand the reach of the roots. Although you can kind of see in these images, if you could really see well, these photos are really great because you can see the mycorrhizae and the roots, but the mycorrhizae filaments are just like end-to-end cells that reach out and grow beyond out from those plant roots. So as I mentioned, most plants have an association with mycorrhizae, excuse me. And this relationship is symbiotic, very beneficial to both. They convert the insoluble nutrients into plant available forms, and that's where chemical fertilizers are not in plant available form to be able to be easily transformed. And that's one of the reasons we talk about the fact that fertilizers often end up in our water systems, either running off the property or contaminating soil water, because it cannot be captured and converted in the way that most plants need. And then, of course, the waste of mycorrhizae provides more nitrogen. So there's two types of mycorrhizae, and I'm not going to get into this too much, but it's just nice to understand that you've got two forms that work very differently and, again, very beneficial. And mycorrhizae is critical for the transfer and uptake of phosphorus by plants and other nutrients. Got a whole list of them here. Talk to you about somebody was asking about the molds, and this is a good example of kind of how, when you first discover, if you catch dog vomit slime mold coming up in your mulch pile, it originally looks like this. It starts morphing and then eventually decays, and then it kind of just poofs if you disturb it. Totally innocuous, not harmful at all to the soils. We've got protozoa and uh, threadworms, and they feed on bacteria. The good form of nematodes help keep root nematodes under control. So does mycorrhizae. But they require more porous soil. And so if you have very compacted soils, they won't be there to do their jobs. Then we get into the macroorganisms, which are mostly arthropods. And again, they're food for other members of the soil food web. And their chitinous skeletons, again, get broken down and those nutrients recycled. And they're a great form of the part of the poop loop because of their excretions. And they're the ones that really start shredding and breaking down the larger plant materials so that these organisms in the soil can start utilizing it. And there's also things like soil mites, so tiny. I know every once in a while I'm out in the garden, I see this tiny, tiny little red dot on my skin. This is what those are. And springtails, they're very, very tiny. It's just kind of a wonder out there. And termites and ants, yeah, we don't want them next to our house foundation, but out in the environment, out in my woodland down here, we need those to help break down the cellulose and recycle that back into the environment. They also construct tunnels and that help aerate the soil, and they move the bacteria in that just by being on their skeletons and moving through the soil. So it keeps things mixed up and more uniform in the soil. And we all love earthworms, and they are fabulous for the soil. I know that once I've gotten my soils working properly, and I do, I can go out and anytime dig up a shovelful of soil if I'm planting something, and I've got just this wonderful population of these guys. They're master shredders in terms of taking matter from above ground and incorporating it into the soil itself. Again, the poop that they excrete becomes food for something else. So where your worms exist, you usually have pretty good soils. It's a good indicator. And those castings, are their poop, we refer to as vermicastings. And often that's another good thing to kind of add. I'll talk a little bit about sheet mulching, but vermicastings are wonderful if you don't already have good soils. Getting some of those and using them to amend your soils is a great starter. Again, earthworms help. Their excretions are richer in so many of all the nutrients that we need. So the benefits of the soil food web include the eliminating and reducing the need for all those chemicals that a lot of us have relied on in the past and not having to use because they provide it. They do the work. They keep the pathogens in check. But there needs to be a good diversity. They improve the water and air holding capacity of your soils. And again, your plants will be healthier. So we talked about the slime. I think that one got out of place. So the bacteria and fungi in the soil are what we want to think is the equivalent in terms of providing nutrients as fertilizer. And the protozoa and the nematodes and the termites and the ants and anything else that moves through the soil are equivalent to the fertilizer spreader. They are constantly moving those nutrients around and making them available to plants. Now, there's really kind of this whole line or in terms of shrubs and trees and perennials, think of woody plants versus your annuals, grasses, and veggies. Not only do those soils differ a bit in terms of their pH levels, but trees and shrubs, so woody plants prefer fungal-dominated soils that have more fungi and mycorrhizae in the soils, as opposed to the soils that we want to grow, our veggies, annuals, and grasses, are more bacteria-dominated. and you will see that you just don't have the kinds of populations of mycorrhizae there simply because they require the chemistry and biology of the woody plants to survive. It's all about relationship. So when you do use chemical fertilizers, and I will distinguish that from organic fertilizers, it actually will reduce the soil production of your plant available nitrogen because it affects the populations in the soil food web. It slows down and halts that formation of carbon in the soil. It essentially starves out and reduces the numbers of kinds of organisms that you want in your soil, and also irritates the worms. It also, because of that, and the result of that is deteriorating your soil structure, decreasing the water holding capacity. It increases the salts in your soils because that's the form that all of these minerals are in fertilizers, is these natural salts. And then that has the result of increasing pathogens and pests. Rototilling itself as a function, it's fine and dandy. Excuse me, my friend wants up. Rototilling is fine and dandy to do once to get your ground working, to get if you're only have 2% organic matter, rototilling in one time a nice thick layer of compost, and we'll talk about that later, it will not hurt the soil because things will return quickly as that organic matter starts to get incorporated. But doing it on a regular basis breaks up the fungal hyphae in the soil. It destroys the worms. It pulverizes the arthropods in the soil. And eventually it causes it to compact more and reduces the air and water holding capacity. So on a normal basis, you just want to be putting compost on top of the ground and letting all these organisms do their work. So the soil food web is just a self-reinforcing feedback loop that takes care of itself. Whereas soil decline, doing the activities like applying fertilizer and rototilling, also is a self-reinforcing loop, not to the good side of things. So in order to build your soil, we need to look at adding organic matter. So, and no matter what type of soil structure you have, clay, sand, or silt, or something in between, adding that organic matter to the soil will improve your soil structure. And then you get all the other benefits that the organisms in the soil provide, including improved nutrient availability, all the rest. Keep working on this, minimizing disease and creating that correct pH level that it needs around your plants. So the types of amendments you want to consider using in your soil include compost, and compost is always incorporated into the soil, whether you do it yourself or you let it occur naturally. Mulch, which is used on top of the soil. I'll just mention compost teas. The mycorrhizal fungi, I'll talk a little bit about strategies for that, but I don't recommend going and buying it out of packages at the store. And I will also mention the biochar and rock dust. Those have not proven to be beneficial in the way that they're touted to be. Biochar in particular is okay if it's used in compost itself, the way it holds on to organisms and nutrients. It's not a bad thing, but it's not by itself going to improve your soil, and neither will rock dust. Most of our soils have enough nutrients that plants need. It's a matter of unlocking them using the soil food web to make them available to your plants. So compost, that's a whole nother class in itself, and And I do compost at home, but compost is really high in microbial life. And so by composting and putting that down on your soil, you're adding more diversity in terms of that life to the soil, but it really boosts the numbers of organisms because you're feeding them. It's like giving them a party. Um, you can use it to inoculate your soils, but you really want to be careful that materials that you're using don't have herbicides, pesticides, or fungicides in it, including if you have got horse manure, make sure you have composted it well so that the dewormers and other types of uh, things that horses are treated with don't get used fresh in your soil. You don't want to be harming the organisms. Um, my recommendation typically is to start with like a 4-inch layer of compost if you've never done this before, and get it incorporated, which is like 12 cubic yards per 1,000 square feet. Get that worked into your soil, and then as you plant things that have roots and you put mulch on top, you're going to be building your soils and giving a boost to your soil organisms. Animal manures are great. Most of them need to be composted, especially steer, chicken, anything like that. Llama and alpaca poo, rabbit poo is great. You can put that right on and into the soil. But I have a chicken coop and I just incorporate mine right into my compost bin. Green manures are great. You can plant those, and especially in the wintertime right now, let those grow. You've got roots in the soil that are feeding soil organisms. And at that point, and plus, oftentimes these support pollinators as well. But you can allow these green manures just to compost in place. And again, it's organic matter feeding the soil. Using legumes will help boost the nitrogen content of your soil. And they do have spring and fall planting mixes available. So depending on the timing for you, you can look at that to choose something. Cover crops are a great way of both providing more soil improvement, but also shading the soil like mulches do. Plant them alongside and under plants. That helps. The more diversity of roots you have in the soil, the more diversity of soil organisms you will have. So by using cover crops, you kind of enhance that because you're adding more diversity. They also, because they bloom, they're attracting and feeding beneficial insects that will help control pests. And if you choose, again, the right types, you can also use it to help fix more nitrogen. Organic mulches like wood chips and leaves and pine needles, you can use those wherever you need them and as appropriate. You want to be careful about the use of mulches in fire hazard areas. I live in a very high fire hazard area. You don't use them within 5 feet of your home or structures. But other than that, and you don't want to get crazy deep with it either. You want to stay 3 inches or lower. 2 to 3 inches is the right amount in terms of mulches if you're in, again, a high fire hazard area. But otherwise, mulches eventually decay and get incorporated into the soil as well. Each 1% increase in soil organic matter helps to hold 20,000 gallons or more per acre. So it really does enhance the water holding capacity of your soil. I really see that because at my own yard, it's made a huge difference in my soils holding water and not drying out so quickly. So again, mulch is anything that goes on top of the soil. Just make sure you taper mulches away from the trunks and the crowns of plants. You don't want to be rotting them out. Compost tea is one of those things that we as master gardeners do not teach, and That's because everything is based on research and the ability to duplicate and replicate and get the same results. Well, compost in its own right is constantly changing because you're putting different things in, into the pile all the time. But it is a good form. Again, if compost is good, compost tea by its nature, if you're making it properly, will help you grow a population of beneficial soil organisms that can be applied to the garden and to plants. But you just need to know that it's there and use it wisely. Now, somebody just tried giving me a box of compost in tea bags to make compost tea. And I looked at that and thought, there's no way in heck that this dried out compost is going to have the kinds of soil organisms that you want to replicate. I mean, so don't fall for that either. You need to create, if you're going to try to do compost teas, you need to do it from live living compost, not something that's been dried out and packaged and who knows how long it's been sitting on a shelf. I'm going to talk quickly about landscape fabrics because they are so non-beneficial to soils. They really denigrate soil quality and the soil impact, the soil food web in a huge way. When organic matter can't interact with that top soil level and be incorporated into the soil, now you're starving those soil organisms that are underneath. I get that sometimes weeding is a huge issue for most of us. It is for me too. But that's where mulch comes in. That's where getting out there and doing some weeding and using other methods to control weeds, but it's really not beneficial. And so what eventually, because you don't have this going on, the soil food web can't do its thing under this, you end up with soils that become more compacted over time because of the lack of the ability to pull in that organic matter. Sheet mulching is a fabulous way to improve soil if you don't want to rototill. And usually you want to, this is where you put a lot of plant material. I like using Toby Hemingway's image, his suggestion. If you can get an 8 or 12-inch layer, especially if you're trying to replace a lawn or you're working with an area that has not been planted, maybe the soil's been scraped off, you're starting from scratch, doing sheet mulching like this will improve your soil vastly, quickly, within a couple months' time. So again, these nutrients going to the nursery and buying these types of nutrients really aren't going to be that beneficial to you. They don't do much. Put down compost. I've got just a little bit of we're almost done, a sample food calendar. In the springtime, get your compost out, get it cooking, refresh mulch under trees. Soybean meal can be helpful. And again, it's an organic product. Summer, again, keep your veggies composted, making sure that those layers aren't getting so thin that they're no longer shading the soil and feeding the soil. In the fall is a good time to plant your green mulches and gather up and spread the leaves. In my yard, I have a lot of oak trees, a lot of fruit trees, and I use those leaves. I pretty much leave them laying except in the pathways. That's how I keep my oak trees fed without doing anything. I don't bring in other stuff. And then, of course, winter's a wonderful time for sitting down and reading about our favorite hobby of gardening. So again, no one's ever fertilized. Just again, keep thinking about the natural systems you see, because we can reap the same kind of benefits if we take that approach in our own yards. So with that, I am done.
Great. Thank you so much, Kit. Um, you really took me back in the very beginning to being in 8th grade in photosynthesis, and then you took me along, and I went back to college for some bacteria and fungi and yeast, and so it was very nice to take the tour of the knowledge that is somewhere in my head, and you woke it back up, and I was like, "Wow, it really is in the soil food web." So thank you so much for bringing back some knowledge and imparting some new for me. I do remember telling a girlfriend I was gardening with, she helped me plant my garden one year, which was so sweet, my veggies. And I was telling her how soil was alive. And I think it kind of creeped her out. And when I see all the little soil food web photos you share, I also am kind of creeped out of all the little bacteria and stuff in there. But I'm going to be positive and say they're good. They're good. They're good. My soil is alive and they're good. Um,
Yes.
we did have a few questions that were coming up, and if you can't answer any of these, feel free to say you can't. I'm not sure about the answer of this one. So, most California native plants aren't nitrogen hungry. Is that true?
That is true. They are adapted and evolved with soils that are not nitrogen rich. And again, the nitrogen they do need, they get through the soil food web, and particularly in that relationship with mycorrhizae. Very
Yes,
true.
and I do want to remind
And
people that
that's
this was recorded in case they missed anything because I saw some people log in a little bit later. So it's all recorded. It's on Facebook and on our YouTube channel for the UC Master Gardener program. And we did have a question of is your presentation available? And it was great because your own Master Gardener program in your county answered the question that your presentation slides are available and provided the link. So if you wanted to do the soil test, jar shake thing that was talked about in the beginning. You can get the directions off of that. And so you can see it there. And if you can't pull this off the screen, it's also in the comments section. So you can look for the Master Gardeners of El Dorado County and look for their comment and get this presentation.
Yeah, that is a longer, more involved presentation
Yes.
by about 3 times.
All right, we're almost out of time. So let me add this one last question from Valerie. Should be on the screen. With the latest soil knowledge, is there a new standard of what to use when creating a raised garden bed?
I'm still amazed by the number of people who use soil in raised beds, and that is not a wise idea. Maybe 1/3 soil, and then the rest all potting soil and organic matter, simply because soil by itself behaves differently once you put it into a raised bed, and you don't get as good a drainage. You don't have that same. So again, the soil in a raised bed as opposed to tiers. I have terraces in my yard, and they are soil, my native soil. But it's a different thing for raised beds. So if you're using raised beds, make sure that you have as much organic matter in the form of potting soil and or compost mixed in with that soil.
Yes, and guess what? We have some positive comments for you. We have Lisa Howard, good overview. Thank you so much. And we just have the great old thank you from Jerry. And this is the best one so far. This was great. Thank you. And Kit, with that, we
Thank
want
you.
to say thank you so much to everyone who joined us today. We really appreciate you being here and excusing our technical difficulty in the beginning. But Kit, you overcame it. We are so proud of you. And thank you so much for sharing your knowledge on soil. I have a new respect for this soil web. I'll look at worms and little buggies outside differently. So thank you so much. This is going to be the last of our lives for this week. However, we do have partners and other people, other UC Master Gardener programs in local counties doing soils work and soils week. So if you want to Google search or hashtag search, it's hashtag Healthy Soils Week 2022, I believe is what it is. So thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate with you. And if you want to connect and you have more questions, if you want to know exactly about your soil and you want someone else to talk to you about it, we do have our local UC Master Gardener programs. We dropped in the link how to find us. Kit is in El Dorado County. She's a volunteer there. I'm a volunteer in Sutter Yuba County. So we know our soils in our area and can help you connect and get the right information for your area, science-based information. Kit brought up that we've all been taught one way of doing things. There's a whole nother way of doing things now. And we're really happy to share that with you. Kit, any final words?
Yes, so I'm also the horticulture chair for our chapter of the Native Plant Society. And so I would encourage you to also look at the Homegrown Habitat page on Facebook. We talk about soils in the context of growing natives, which there were a couple of questions about. So please come join us there and I can answer more questions because there is a lot of different, there's a
Yes.
whole line of how people feel about amending soils with native plants. So we can talk about that in more detail.
Yes. Great. Thank you so much, everyone. We really appreciate you. We're going to end our broadcast now. Take care.
Great. Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you.